I am not an activist. I'm not here as an anti-nuclear activist. I'm here as a scientist. I committed a long time ago to speaking to anyone who asks nicely. And so Ian asked very nicely, so I'm very happy to be here to share the results, a few just snippets of what we've been up to for the last few years. So let me get right back into it. So recent discussions of the merits of nuclear energy relative to renewables inevitably point to the perceived benefits. Inevitably point to the perceived benefits of the low carbon footprint and an ability to provide massive 24/7 baseload electricity production. Although both of these perceived attributes, positive attributes, have been debated quite substantially of late. But local and regional governments are often very supportive of nuclear options, and as shown here this is the VC Summer power plant that's about 20 miles up the road from where I live, up the river actually from where I live, where the tritium flows, and what you see here are two new AP1000s under construction and the old reactor up on the lake, and so local governments are incredibly supportive of these kinds of construction sites because of the perceived and purported large positive economic benefits of these mega sites. And this is these are the other two reactors that are under construction in the US. So there's 4 new reactors under construction in the US at the moment. They're all within spitting distance of my house, really. And so I have a personal interest. And so this is another one. And of course, the local governments are really, really keen on these because look at the number of cars in the parking lots. These two sites alone employ over 10,000 people, or did until a few weeks ago at least. And but of course, right now there's a huge issue in that these benefits clearly appear to be very short-lived, as mentioned earlier in the previous talk. Westinghouse, the main contractor here, has declared bankruptcy, largely as a result of cost overruns and time overruns at these two sites in South Carolina and Georgia. And so guess who's going to end up footing the bill for the third of the construction that's already been underway? Me, the ratepayer, to the tune of several $billion. So, again, it's clear that even these local regional benefits that have been suggested are probably vastly overrated. Anyway, and also, of course, I don't think Dave mentioned this, but it's well known that the renewable sector is employing many more people in the U.S., at least at this point in time, than the nuclear industry, of course. So that's anyway. In the broader view of things, it's another shortcoming is that the inclusive economic costs of nuclear accidents, such as those that occurred at Chernobyl and Fukushima, but there are actually a couple hundred other accidents that have occurred over the years, those inclusive costs of those accidents are rarely considered in the grand scheme of the costs of nuclear energy. And for instance, there was a recent study just last year commissioned by the Green Cross, conducted by Samet and CO from the other USC, as I call it, the University of Southern California, I believe, where they basically did a literature review and calculated that the economic costs of the Chernobyl disaster are in excess of $700 billion. Just a humongous amount. We don't know what the Fukushima accident is going to cost, but you can bet it's going to be more than that. And they've already spent a few $100 billion, really, and the other economic consequences are again huge. So, again, we need to be aware of these other issues, these other costs that are involved. The environmental costs of nuclear accidents, to my knowledge, have never been assessed, have never been tabulated. And in part, my view is that, in my opinion, one reason for this is that, of course, there have not been any resources allocated to that kind of activity, because the official view of the environmental ecological consequences has been that there are none. So, for instance, in the mid-2000s, the Chernobyl Forum report, commissioned by the International Atomic Energy Agency, many of you are probably aware of this, suggested, in the complete absence of any data, that because the plants and animals appear to be thriving, in their opinion, with no data to support this, there must not be any real effects of the radiation associated with the disaster. And that's been sort of the unintended interpretation, even though there was really nothing to support it. And this sort of view of the world has been perpetuated in more recent reports related to Fukushima. For instance, the UNSCAR reports, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, which is really the main scientific committee that informs the United Nations, broadly speaking. They're supposed to be unbiased. They're supposed to represent the entire scientific worldview, and yet they have suggested, again, in the near absence of any supportive information, and that there would be no consequences of the radiation associated with the Fukushima disaster. So again, very clearly pointing to the fact that there are some biases built into this system that, again, as a scientist, as an ecologist, as an evolutionary biologist working in a university setting, I'd never really faced these kinds of biases before, this kind of self-censorship that seems to be dictating policy at the broadest levels. So anyway, here's another, actually this is another snippet from the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency from his 2015 report, which basically takes the UNSCAR report and trims it down and basically makes it even more benign. Basically says there are no consequences predicted from the Fukushima disaster. So anyway, just to reiterate, basically no data is provided in support of these positions, and they're intended to mislead you, to direct you towards this conclusion that there are no radiation effects. Even though they may not explicitly say that there are no radiation effects, that is clearly the intention of the way these arguments are presented. And so with what's left of my talk today, I wanted to summarize a few key findings that we and others have generated over the last 15 years or so in both Chernobyl and Fukushima. And I'm going to start with the punchlines, the conclusions, because I almost never make it to the end of my talk, so might as well just get it over with to begin with. And the main findings, and these are all based on published, peer-reviewed scientific reports. Many of these studies are ours, but they're not just ours. And often there are summaries that we have conducted, meta-analyses that we've conducted, like Ian's very famous report on nuclear power reactors and leukemia now. We make use of all the data that's available. And the basic bottom line is not really surprising. If you add radiation to a system, there will be increased mutation rates. Genes are damaged by ionizing radiation. We've known this for almost a century, and yet no one had bothered to really put it all together within the context of a nuclear accident. We know that there are fertility consequences. And again, this isn't really new to somebody who studies human fertility. We know that, for instance, radiation therapy associated with cancer treatment often leads to temporary or permanent sterility in humans. It turns out that the birds and the mice living in Chernobyl also show dramatic reductions in fertility. It's most obvious in the males because it's easy to count sperm, but it probably is important for females too. We see reduced survival and longevity in the organisms we look at. We see increased rates of developmental abnormalities, including tumors, cataracts, and other kinds of strange developmental effects that you just don't see anywhere else. We see impaired neurological development, as evidenced most obviously by reduced brain size in both birds and rodents. And it turns out in humans living in the area as well, but that's not our work. We see reduced population sizes that undoubtedly stems from the fact that if you have reduced fertility and reduced survival, of course, populations are going to decline. Again, nothing really surprising, but hadn't been documented and certainly not mentioned in the UN reports. We see reduced species richness or biodiversity as a consequence of reduced population sizes. We even see local extinctions of some species in the hottest areas of Chernobyl. Haven't done enough work in Fukushima to really say what's going on there. The area that's affected is much smaller, so it remains to be seen what the ultimate outcome will be, but that's where it's heading. Impaired nutrient cycling. I don't know if there are any ecologists or environmental biologists in the room, but nutrient cycling is a fundamental ecological process that determines ecosystem productivity. And what we've been documenting in both Chernobyl and Fukushima is that the microbial community that normally recycles the dead organic matter is impaired by the elevated radiation levels. And so this leads to downstream effects on the entire community. And then finally, at least for today, a recent analysis we did showed that at least so far in Chernobyl, there's very little evidence of adaptive evolution in response to this environmental change. We see some evidence with the microbes, with the bacteria, and maybe there might be some good evidence there, but for the most part, most of the other organisms, there's no good evidence that they're adapting to this new kind of environmental perturbance, although maybe it's too soon. Maybe 30 years is too soon for a large animal with fewer generations than bacteria. Okay, so let's just sort of run through as much as we can until the bell rings, and then we'll take it from there. So when the Chernobyl Forum report came out in the mid-2000s, we'd been working in Chernobyl for a few years, published a few papers, and we'd been reviewing some of the Eastern European literature. And so when the Forum report came out and said, oh, there's no problem with Chernobyl, there's no evidence of biological consequences, we sort of scratched our heads and went, what have they been reading? And so we actually spent a few months, went to the library, virtual and otherwise, and gathered up as much of the information as we could concerning experimental analysis of Chernobyl effects that had been conducted up to that point. Most of it other people's, a lot of it from Eastern Europe, that had not been cited in this Chernobyl Forum report. And published this paper in the Trends in Ecology and Evolution. It's a fairly high-end journal. And this table right here is just one part of it, and you don't have to read the table. It's just a list of the 30-odd studies that have been conducted up to that point that showed genetic damage. So more than 30 studies have been conducted showing genetic damage as a result of the Chernobyl radiation. And so this was really kind of informative to us that there was something else going on. We since followed this up with another meta-analysis with a bunch more studies showing that basically almost every study that's been conducted, and there's many more now in the last 10 years, all show genetic damage. We see similar effects in naturally radioactive areas. We published a paper a few years ago in Cambridge Philosophical Society. We see that fertility is affected, in this case in birds. We just published a paper showing that male fertility in flowers, pollen viability, is also affected in both Chernobyl and Fukushima. We see increased rates of tumors and other kinds of developmental abnormalities. Again, published a bunch of papers on this topic. We see cataracts in the eyes. It turns out that radiation induces a very specific kind of cataract in the eye that's easily diagnosed. And it turns out that the birds and the small rodents and the people show elevated rates of these kinds of radiation-induced cataract. Again, there's another paper. They have smaller brains with cognitive consequences as a result. And basically, when we look at all of them, every major group of organisms that we've looked at shows consequences. We see the same thing in Fukushima happening now. And basically, if we do the fundamental biology, we see that there are big effects on abundance, fewer birds in the more radioactive areas, fewer species in the more radioactive areas. And if you do sort of the regression analysis, you see that it's this kind of gradual decline with radiation, following what we call a linear no-threshold response. There is no safe level of radiation as far as these birds are concerned. Oh, and the bell's up. Let me just give the final slide here. Lots of power plants, no adaptations of adaptation. Oh, you know what? My concluding slide is different. So I'm just going to end right there and say, so what do we need to do about it? What needs to be done? Any ideas? Any suggestions? It's a little too obvious, you know. Say again? That's of course the answer that I'm looking for, and I hope you'll join me in suggesting that more research by independent scientists needs to be conducted, not only in Chernobyl but in Fukushima. Thank you very much.